The butler's face crumpled, and Miss Marple knew she had struck at the heart of the matter. "She telephoned the inn around 10 o'clock yesterday morning," he admitted in a broken voice. "She asked to speak with Dr. Hartwell, and when they told her he was there and available, she realized immediately what had happened." "And what was her reaction?" "She was furious, miss, more furious than I'd ever seen her in all my years of service. She summoned me to the morning room and demanded to know why I had taken it upon myself to turn away her invited guest. She said I had betrayed her trust just as thoroughly as Mrs. Pemberton and Master Timothy had done." Captain Greystone leaned forward intently. "What exactly did she say to you, Whitmore?" "She said that she could forgive theft, motivated by desperation, but that she could never forgive deliberate deception and interference with her personal affairs. She said I had proven myself untrustworthy and that she would have to dismiss me immediately without a reference." The picture was becoming clearer now. Whitmore's interference had backfired spectacularly, not only failing to prevent the Foundation meeting, but actually accelerating Lady Constance's loss of faith in her household staff. His dismissal would have meant destitution at age 70, with no prospects for other employment and no resources to fall back on. "Whitmore," Miss Marple said gently, "what happened after Lady Constance dismissed you?" "I begged her to reconsider, miss. I explained that everything I had done was out of loyalty to the family, that I couldn't bear to see the estate given away to strangers. I told her about the anonymous letters and admitted that I had been trying to protect the family from making a terrible mistake." "How did she respond to your confession about the letters?" "She was horrified. She said that threatening letters constituted criminal behavior and that she would have to report the matter to the police. She ordered me to leave her presence immediately and to pack my belongings for departure that afternoon." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The sequence of events was becoming tragically clear. Whitmore's well-intentioned but misguided attempts to protect the Greystone family had instead created a crisis that threatened to destroy both Lady Constance's plans and his own future security. "Whitmore," she continued, "you left Lady Constance in the morning room after she dismissed you. What did you do next?" "I went to my room and began packing, just as she had ordered. But I kept thinking about how unfair it all was, how I had devoted my entire adult life to this family, only to be cast aside for trying to protect their interests. And then—" Whitmore's hands were shaking violently now, and his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I went back to the morning room around 9:30. I wanted to make one final appeal, to try to make her understand that everything I had done was motivated by love and loyalty. Was Lady Constance still there when you returned?" "Yes, miss. She was sitting at the tea table writing in her journal. She looked up when I entered, and I could see that she had been crying. It broke my heart to see her in such distress." Miss Marple felt the familiar chill that came with approaching the crucial moment in a murder case. "What happened when you tried to speak with her?" "She wouldn't listen to me. She said that my actions had proven I was capable of deception and manipulation, and that she could no longer trust anything I said. She told me to leave immediately or she would call the police to have me removed." "And your response?" Whitmore was silent for a long moment, his face a mask of anguish and regret. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that everyone in the room had to strain to hear him. "I lost my temper, miss. For the first time in 37 years of service, I raised my voice to a member of the Greystone family. I told her she was being ungrateful and foolish, that she was throwing away centuries of family heritage for the sake of political correctness and modern guilt." "Did she respond to your outburst?" She stood up and moved toward the fireplace, reaching for the bell pull to summon help. "She said she was going to have me forcibly removed from the property and that she would contact the police immediately about the threatening letters." Miss Marple could see the tragic inevitability of what had followed, a desperate man facing the complete destruction of his life and livelihood, confronted with the immediate prospect of criminal prosecution. The elements were all present for a moment of fatal violence. "Whitmore," she said, her voice filled with compassion rather than accusation, "Lady Constance reached for the bell pull, and you realized that within minutes the police would be called and your situation would become irreversible." The butler nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "I picked up the poker from the fireplace stand, miss. I only meant to frighten her, to make her listen to reason. But when I raised it, she turned to face me, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She was afraid of me who had served her faithfully for nearly 4 decades. And then? I don't remember exactly what happened next, miss. It was as if something else took control of my actions. The next thing I knew, she was lying on the floor and there was blood everywhere. The confession hung in the air like a physical presence, stunning in its simplicity and tragic inevitability. Miss Marple looked around the room at the faces of the other household members, seeing shock, horror, and a kind of terrible understanding in their expressions. Captain Greystone was the first to break the silence. "Whitmore, are you saying that you struck Aunt Constance with the poker?" "Yes, sir," Whitmore replied, his voice barely audible. "God forgive me, but I killed her ladyship. I killed the woman I had served and respected for more than half my life." The room remained silent for several long moments as the full weight of Whitmore's confession settled over the assembled group. Miss Marple felt a profound sadness as she observed the broken man before her, a devoted servant whose misguided loyalty had led him to destroy the very person he had tried to protect. "Whitmore," she said gently, "what did you do after Lady Constance fell?" "I panicked, miss. I realized what I had done and I couldn't think clearly. I kept hoping that maybe she wasn't really hurt badly, that maybe she would recover consciousness, and everything could somehow be made right." "But you must have known that her injuries were fatal." Whitmore nodded miserably. "Yes, miss. There was so much blood and she wasn't breathing. I knew I had killed her, but I couldn't accept it. I kept telling myself it was an accident, that I hadn't meant for it to happen." "What did you do next?" "I cleaned the poker and returned it to the fireplace stand. I wiped down everything I had touched, and I tried to arrange the scene to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. But my hands were shaking so badly that I kept making mistakes." Miss Marple nodded. This explained the inconsistencies in the crime scene that had puzzled Inspector Craddock, the careful cleaning of some surfaces, while others retained clear evidence of the crime. "Whitmore," Captain Greystone said, his voice stern but not unkind, "why did you continue with the charade of discovering the body this morning? Why didn't you confess immediately?" "I was terrified, sir. I knew that if I admitted what I had done, I would hang for murder. I kept hoping that somehow the police would decide it was a burglary, and the investigation would focus on outsiders rather than the household staff." Dr. Hartwell, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. "Mr. Whitmore, I want you to know that I never intended to cause harm to anyone in this household. If I had known that Lady Constance's plans would lead to such tragedy, I would never have agreed to meet with her." Whitmore looked at him with haunted eyes. "It wasn't your fault, sir. It was mine entirely. My pride and my misguided sense of loyalty turned me into a murderer. Lady Constance was trying to do something honorable, trying to right an old wrong, and I destroyed her for it." Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, where the last light of evening was fading into darkness. The case was solved, but she felt none of the satisfaction that usually accompanied the resolution of a mystery. Instead, she felt only sadness for the waste of 2 lives, one taken by violence, the other destroyed by a moment of fatal, poor judgment. "Captain Greystone," she said quietly, "I believe we need to contact Inspector Craddock immediately. Whitmore, we'll need to make a formal confession, and arrangements will have to be made for his arrest." "Of course," Captain Greystone replied. "Whitmore, I'm afraid I'll have to detain you until the inspector arrives. I hope you understand that I have no choice in the matter." Whitmore nodded with resignation. "I understand, sir. I've been expecting this moment since I found the courage to tell the truth. In a way, it's a relief to have the deception finally ended." Mrs. Pemberton, who had remained silent throughout Whitmore's confession, finally spoke. "Whitmore, I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. We're both old servants who have given our lives to this family, and the thought of being cast aside in our old age is terrifying. I don't condone what happened, but I understand the desperation that drove you to it." Timothy stirred in his chair, seeming to shake off the shock that had held him motionless during the confession. "This is all my fault," he said suddenly. "If I hadn't involved you in my theft scheme, Aunt Constance would never have lost faith in the household staff. She might have listened to your concerns about the foundation instead of dismissing you immediately." "No, Master Timothy," Whitmore said firmly. "What I did was my choice and my responsibility. Your actions may have contributed to the situation, but they didn't force me to pick up that poker. I did that of my own free will, and I must face the consequences alone." Vivian had been crying quietly throughout the confession, and she now looked up with tear-streaked cheeks. "Whitmore, is there anything we can do for you? Any way we can help with legal representation or support during the trial?" "That's very kind of you, Miss Vivian, but I don't think there's much that can be done. I struck down an innocent woman in a moment of rage and fear. The law is quite clear about the consequences of such actions." Miss Marple turned back to the group, her expression thoughtful. "Actually, there may be some mitigating circumstances that could influence the court's decision. Whitmore's age, his long record of faithful service, his obvious remorse, and the extreme provocation he faced might result in a sentence less than death." "Do you really think so?" Captain Greystone asked hopefully. "It's possible. The confession was voluntary and complete, which courts often view favorably. And the circumstances that led to the crime, the threatening of his livelihood and security, after decades of loyal service, might be seen as contributing factors rather than mere excuses." Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. "If I may ask, what will happen to Lady Constance's plans for the foundation? I wouldn't want her death to prevent the completion of work that was so important to her." Captain Greystone considered this question carefully. "I'll need to consult with the family solicitors, but I believe that Lady Constance's final will and the foundation documents she prepared should still be legally valid. If the family agrees, we can proceed with her plans as she intended." "And the estate?" Vivian asked quietly. "That will depend on the terms of her final will and the family's wishes. But I think we should honor Aunt Constance's intentions regarding both the National Trust donation and the Sarah Hartwell Foundation." "It seems the least we can do to honor her memory," Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "I think Lady Constance would be pleased to know that her death didn't prevent the completion of her work. The tragedy of this case is that Whitmore's actions were not only criminal but completely unnecessary. Lady Constance's plans were motivated by conscience and historical justice, not by any desire to harm the family." Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, accompanied by 2 constables, and looking grimmer than Miss Marple had yet seen him. Whitmore's formal confession was recorded with methodical thoroughness, and the butler was taken into custody with quiet dignity. As he was led away, he paused to address the assembled family members one final time. "I want you all to know that I have loved this family and this house for my entire adult life," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion. "What I did was unforgivable, but it came from a place of deep attachment rather than malice. I pray that you can remember the good years of my service, rather than this terrible ending. After Whitmore's departure, the household seemed to exhale collectively, as if a terrible weight had been lifted from the atmosphere. The truth had been revealed, justice would be served, and the healing process could begin. Dr. Hartwell announced his intention to return to London the following morning, but not before spending some time examining the Silver Teapot and learning more about Sarah Hartwell's story. "I feel an obligation to ensure that her tale is told accurately and completely," he explained. "Lady Constance's research has revealed aspects of my family's history that we never knew, and I want to honor both Sarah's memory and Lady Constance's efforts on her behalf." Miss Marple spent her final evening at Greystone Manor in quiet contemplation, sitting by the fire in the library, with her knitting and reflecting on the events of the past few days. The case had been solved, but it left her with a profound sense of the tragedy that could result when fear and desperation overcame reason and compassion. Captain Greystone joined her as the evening grew late, bringing 2 glasses of brandy and settling into a chair near the fireplace. "Miss Marple," he said, "I want to thank you for your help in unraveling this terrible business. I'm not sure we would ever have gotten to the truth without your insights." "I'm afraid the truth was there all along, Captain Greystone. It simply required someone willing to look beyond the obvious motives and consider the psychological pressures that were affecting everyone in the household." "Do you think Whitmore will hang for what he did?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I hope not. While his actions were inexcusable, they were also understandable in human terms. A good barrister might be able to argue for manslaughter rather than premeditated murder, especially given the circumstances that led to the crime." "And what about the rest of us? Timothy and his theft, Mrs. Pemberton's betrayal, my own failure. To recognize the signs of crisis in the household, how do we move forward from this?" "By honoring Lady Constance's memory and completing the work she began," Miss Marple replied. "By learning from the mistakes that led to this tragedy and ensuring that such a crisis never develops again. And by remembering that loyalty and love, when misdirected, can be just as destructive as hatred and malice." The next morning brought a crisp autumn day with clear skies and the promise of better weather ahead. Miss Marple prepared for her departure with mixed feelings: relief that the case was resolved, sadness for the lives that had been destroyed, and a quiet satisfaction that Lady Constance's work would continue despite the tragedy that had claimed her life. As her taxi pulled away from Greystone Manor, Miss Marple looked back at the ancient stone walls and ivy-covered towers that had witnessed so much history, both glorious and tragic. The Silver Teapot would remain in the house, no longer hidden away but displayed openly with the full story of Sarah Hartwell's treatment and Lady Constance's efforts to make amends. The curse of the Silver Teapot had finally been broken, not by supernatural intervention, but by human courage in facing uncomfortable truths and making difficult moral choices. The tragedies that had befallen the Greystone family over the generations had not been the result of supernatural vengeance, but of guilt and shame that had festered in the darkness of family secrets. Lady Constance's death had been a terrible price to pay for this revelation, but her legacy would ensure that the injustices of the past were finally acknowledged and addressed. The Sarah Hartwell Foundation would provide opportunities and support for descendants of transported convicts, helping to heal wounds that had been left open for over a century. As the Yorkshire countryside rolled past the taxi windows, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of motives and circumstances that had led to murder at Greystone Manor. Pride, fear, loyalty, greed, and desperation had all played their parts in the tragedy. But ultimately, it had been the collision between past and present, between tradition and progress, that had proved fatal. Whitmore's devotion to the Greystone family had been genuine and admirable, but it had been focused on preserving the status quo rather than supporting the family's growth and moral development. When Lady Constance chose to confront the injustices of the past rather than perpetuate them, Whitmore's narrow conception of loyalty had transformed him from protector into destroyer. The train journey back to St. Mary Mead gave Miss Marple time to organize her thoughts and consider the lessons to be drawn from the case. She had encountered many murders over the years, but few had illustrated so clearly the dangers of allowing fear and pride to override compassion and justice. As the familiar landscapes of her home county came into view, Miss Marple felt the satisfaction that came with returning to the peaceful rhythms of village life. The drama and tragedy of Greystone Manor would fade into memory, but the lessons learned would remain, adding to her understanding of the complex motivations that drove human behavior. The Silver Teapot would continue to serve tea at Greystone Manor, but now it would tell a story of redemption rather than curse, of courage in facing difficult truths rather than the perpetuation of convenient lies. Sarah Hartwell's artistry would finally receive the recognition it deserved, and her story would serve as a reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Miss Marple arrived at her cottage as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, greeted by her garden and her familiar routines, with the quiet pleasure of someone who had been away long enough to appreciate the comforts of home. She settled into her favorite chair with her knitting and a cup of properly brewed tea, reflecting on the strange turns that life could take and the unexpected connections that could link past and present. The case of the Silver Teapot was closed, but its lessons would linger in her memory, ready to inform her understanding of the next mystery that might cross her path. For Miss Marple had learned long ago that human nature remained remarkably consistent across generations, and that the seeds of both tragedy and redemption could be found in the most ordinary circumstances. As evening fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple began a new pattern in her knitting, a complex design that would require patience, skill, and attention to detail. Like the mysteries she solved, it would reveal its beauty only through careful observation and methodical progress, one stitch at a time, until the final pattern emerged complete and satisfying. The Silver Teapot had taught her that some patterns, once established, could persist for generations unless someone had the courage to break them. Lady Constance Greystone had possessed that courage, and though it had cost her life, her sacrifice had ensured that the truth would finally be acknowledged and justice would finally be served. In the quiet of her cottage, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home, Miss Marple raised her teacup in a silent toast to a brave woman who had chosen truth over convenience, justice over tradition, and redemption over the perpetuation of ancient wrongs. The curse of the Silver Teapot was finally broken, and Sarah Hartwell could rest in peace at last. Miss Marple and the curse of the Silver Teapot, every family that served from the Silver Teapot, ended in ruin. And when it was polished again for a wedding, tragedy was bound to follow. The morning mist clung to Greystone Manor like a shroud, obscuring the ancient stone walls and ivy-covered towers that had stood sentinel over the Yorkshire countryside for 3 centuries. In the East Wing's morning room, sunlight filtered through diamond-paned windows, casting prismatic patterns across Persian rugs and mahogany furniture that spoke of old money and older secrets. The room might have been peaceful, even welcoming, were it not for the figure sprawled across the Turkish carpet in a pool of crimson that had already begun to darken at the edges. Lady Constance Greystone lay motionless, her silver hair fanned round her head like a tarnished halo, her morning gown of dove-grey silk now stained with the evidence of violence. Her right hand still clutched a delicate porcelain teacup, its contents spilled across the intricate patterns of the rug, while her left arm stretched toward an ornate silver teapot that sat upon a wheeled serving cart, its polished surface reflecting the pale morning light like a mirror. The teapot itself was a masterpiece of Georgian craftsmanship, adorned with intricate engravings of roses and thorns that seemed to writhe in the dancing light. Its curved spout ended in the head of a serpent, mouth agape as if frozen in the act of delivering poison rather than Earl Grey. The handle was formed by two intertwined vines, their leaves so detailed one could almost see them rustling in an unfelt breeze. But it was the inscription around the base that drew the eye, written in flowing script that had been polished to gleaming clarity. To the Greystone line, may this vessel bring sweetness to your unions and strength to your blood. Inspector Craddock would later note in his official report that the victim had been struck from behind with a heavy object, likely the brass poker that lay beside the cold fireplace, its tip stained with something more sinister than ash. But what would perplex him, and later fascinate Miss Jane Marple, was the curious arrangement of the scene. The tea service had been set for two, with a second cup and saucer placed precisely across from where Lady Constance had fallen. This second cup remained untouched, filled to the brim with tea that had long since grown cold. The butler, a thin, nervous man named Whitmore, who had served the Greystone family for 37 years, discovered the body at precisely 8:15 that morning. His piercing scream had echoed through the manor's corridors, bringing the entire household running. But by the time they arrived, Whitmore had collapsed into a chair, his face the color of old parchment, muttering the same words over and over like an incantation. The curse. The curse has come again. I told them not to use it. I told them. The Silver Teapot, it seemed, carried with it a reputation that extended far beyond its obvious monetary value. For nearly 2 centuries, it had been brought out only for the most special occasions, weddings, christenings, and the rare, formal dinner that demanded the finest china and silver. But each time it graced the Greystone table, misfortune followed as surely as night follows day. The first recorded incident occurred in 1834, when it was used to serve tea at the wedding celebration of Lady Constance's great-great-grandmother, Arabella Greystone. The bride was found dead in her marriage bed 3 days later, victim of what the village doctor diplomatically termed a sudden malady of the heart. The groom, driven mad by grief, threw himself from the manor's highest tower before the funeral. Arrangements could be completed. In 1867, the teapot emerged from storage for the christening of young Master Edmund Greystone. The child lived only 6 months before succumbing to a wasting disease that baffled the finest physicians in London. His parents, unable to bear the tragedy, sold their London townhouse and retreated to the continent, never to return to English soil. The pattern continued through the decades. The teapot appeared, tragedy struck, and the surviving members of the family whispered of curses and supernatural vengeance. Some claimed the silver itself was cursed, forged from metal mined in unholy ground. Others insisted that the engravings were more than mere decoration, that the roses and thorns told a story of ancient betrayal and blood guilt that demanded payment from each generation. By the time Lady Constance inherited the manor in 1951, the teapot had been locked away in the family vault for over 40 years. The last time it had been used was for her own wedding to Sir Reginald Greystone in 1953, and within a year her husband had perished in what appeared to be a hunting accident, but which the local constabulary quietly suspected might have been suicide. Lady Constance herself had never spoken publicly of the teapot's supposed curse, but those close to the family noted that she never entertained formally, never hosted tea parties, and certainly never brought out the family silver for any occasion, no matter how grand, which made its presence on the morning of her death all the more puzzling. According to the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, the teapot had been retrieved from the vault only the day before, polished to a brilliant shine, and placed on the morning-room cart at Lady Constance's specific request. When pressed for details, Mrs. Pemberton could only shake her head and mutter that her ladyship seemed excited about something, almost giddy, like a young girl planning a surprise party. The surprise, it seemed, had been on Lady Constance herself, as the local police cordoned off the morning room and began their preliminary investigation. Word of the tragedy spread through the village of Little Wickham with the speed that only truly scandalous news can achieve. By noon, the Copper Kettle tea room was packed with locals, debating whether the notorious curse had claimed another victim, or if more earthly concerns had motivated the crime. The betting, unofficial but spirited, favored supernatural intervention, over human malice by odds of 3-1. It was in this atmosphere of speculation and superstition that a letter arrived at the modest cottage of Miss Jane Marple, delivered by the afternoon post and bearing the distinctive crest of Greystone Manor. The envelope was of heavy cream paper, the sort that suggested both wealth and gravity, and when Miss Marple slit it open with her silver letter knife, she found herself reading an urgent plea, written in an educated but shaking hand. "My dear Miss Marple," the letter began, "though we have never met, your reputation for discretion and insight in matters of a delicate nature has reached even our remote corner of Yorkshire. I write to you in the gravest circumstances, following the tragic death of my aunt, Lady Constance Greystone, which occurred this very morning under circumstances that have left the local authorities baffled and the household in a state of near panic. While the police appear convinced that my aunt fell victim to a burglar, those of us who knew her well find this explanation insufficient to account for the peculiar details surrounding her demise. I would be eternally grateful if you could see your way clear to visiting Greystone Manor at your earliest convenience. Your railway fare and all expenses will naturally be covered, and I can promise you comfortable accommodations and the cooperation of all members of the household. Time, I fear, is of the essence, as there are certain family matters that require resolution before my aunt's funeral, which has been scheduled for Friday next. I remain your most humble servant, Nigel Greystone, Captain, Royal Artillery, retired." Miss Marple set the letter aside and reached for her knitting, a complex pattern of cables and lace that required just enough attention to occupy her hands while leaving her mind free to wander. She had heard whispers of the Greystone family. Of course, one could hardly live in an English village for 70-odd years without accumulating a vast store of gossip about the local gentry. The tale of the cursed teapot had reached even her quiet corner of St. Mary Mead, brought by visitors who delighted in sharing the more lurid details of rural Yorkshire's supernatural folklore. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that curses, like ghosts and goblins, were most often the invention of those who wished to draw attention away from more mundane but equally damaging truths. In her experience, when valuable objects were involved and family members stood to inherit, the explanation for mysterious deaths was usually disappointingly practical. Greed, jealousy, and desperation were far more reliable killers than ancient curses, though they were admittedly less romantic. Still, there was something in the tone of Captain Greystone's letter that intrigued her. The careful phrasing, the emphasis on time being of the essence, the mention of family matters that require resolution, all suggested complications beyond a simple case of burglary gone wrong. And if there was one thing that Miss Marple found absolutely irresistible, it was a puzzle that appeared to have been constructed specifically to mislead the observer. The next morning found Miss Marple on the early train to Yorkshire, her small travelling case stowed overhead and her knitting bag nestled comfortably in her lap. The journey north took her through countryside that gradually shifted from the gentle rolling hills of her native Cotswolds to the starker, more dramatic landscape of the Yorkshire Dales. Stone walls replaced hedgerows, sheep-dotted fields of increasingly dramatic green, and the very air seemed to carry a different quality of light, sharper and somehow more honest than the soft, golden haze of the south. Greystone Manor sat in a natural amphitheatre carved from the surrounding hills, its grey stone walls rising from carefully manicured grounds that spoke of centuries of careful cultivation. The building itself was a study in architectural evolution, with a Norman keep at its heart, surrounded by Tudor additions and Georgian improvements that had been added as successive generations sought to modernize their ancestral home without sacrificing its essential character. Ivy covered much of the older stonework, and the many-paned windows reflected the afternoon sun like watching eyes. Captain Nigel Greystone met her at the front door, and Miss Marple was struck immediately by the contrast between his military bearing and the anxiety that was clearly etched in the lines around his eyes. He was perhaps 55, with greying hair and the sort of moustache that suggested long service in His Majesty's forces, but his hands shook slightly as he helped her with her coat, and she noticed that he glanced frequently over his shoulder as if expecting unwelcome interruption. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice carrying the crisp diction of his military background, "I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you've come. The situation here has become, well, frankly, it's become rather more complicated than I initially indicated in my letter. Perhaps we might speak privately before I introduce you to the rest of the household." He led her not to the formal drawing room, but to what was clearly his private study, a comfortable masculine retreat filled with military memorabilia, hunting trophies, and shelves lined with books that showed the wear of actual reading rather than mere display. A fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, and the afternoon sun streaming through tall windows created an atmosphere of warmth that seemed at odds with the tension radiating from her host. "Miss Marple," Captain Greystone began, settling himself behind a massive oak desk that had clearly seen generations of use, "I'm afraid I may have misled you somewhat in my letter. While it's quite true that Aunt Constance was found dead yesterday, mourning and equally true that the circumstances were peculiar, I may have understated the complexity of our family situation." Miss Marple settled her knitting in her lap and fixed him with the sort of gentle, expectant look that had encouraged countless confessions over the years. "Perhaps you'd better tell me everything, Captain Greystone. I find that partial truths are often more misleading than outright lies." The captain's laugh was short and bitter. "Quite right, of course. Very well then, the complete truth. Aunt Constance was not simply Lady of the Manor, living quietly in retirement. She was, in fact, in the process of making some rather dramatic changes to her will. Changes that would have affected not only myself, but several other members of the family who had, shall we say, counted on a different outcome." He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the grounds with the air of a man surveying a battlefield. "My aunt never married after Uncle Reginald's death, and she had no children. For years it was understood, though never explicitly stated, that the bulk of the estate would pass to me as the eldest male heir. But in recent months she had begun to make noises about leaving Greystone Manor to the National Trust, with only modest provisions for family members." "And how did the family react to this change of heart?" Miss Marple asked, her fingers moving steadily through her knitting pattern. "Poorly," the captain admitted. "My cousin Vivian, she's Aunt Constance's sister's daughter, had been counting on an inheritance to pay off some rather substantial gambling debts. My nephew Timothy, fresh down from Oxford with expensive tastes and no visible means of support, had likewise assumed he would inherit enough to maintain his current lifestyle indefinitely. And then there's Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, who had been promised a cottage and pension that would now be in jeopardy if the estate changed hands. Quite a collection of interested parties," Miss Marple observed mildly. "And the Silver Teapot? I understand it made an appearance after many years in storage." Captain Greystone's face darkened. "That damned teapot. Forgive the language, Miss Marple, but that particular piece of silver has been nothing but trouble for this family for generations. Aunt Constance had it brought up from the vault 2 days ago, despite Mrs. Pemberton's protests. She seemed almost gleeful about it, as if she were planning some sort of surprise. She made quite a ceremony of having it polished and placed in the morning room, even though she hadn't entertained formally in years. Did she give any indication of why she wanted it brought up specifically then? That's just it. She was being remarkably secretive about her plans. But Whitmore, the butler, overheard her making a telephone call the day before her death. He couldn't make out all the words, but he distinctly heard her say something about putting things right and making amends for old wrongs. She also mentioned meeting someone for morning tea to discuss family business. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in the growing dusk. And who do you suspect this mysterious tea companion might have been? The captain spread his hands helplessly. That's the devil of it. It could have been any of us. Vivian arrived from London the evening before, claiming she wanted to spend time with Aunt Constance before the will changes became final. Timothy drove up from Oxford that same night, supposedly to discuss his plans after graduation. Even Mrs. Pemberton had been acting strangely, muttering about family loyalty and old secrets. Any one of them could have been Aunt Constance's mysterious breakfast guest, but the second teacup was unused, Miss Marple pointed out gently. If she was expecting someone for morning tea, they apparently never arrived, or never had the opportunity. To drink, exactly. Which suggests either that the killer arrived unexpectedly, or that the person she was expecting was, in fact, the killer. Captain Greystone returned to his desk and pulled out a manila folder. I've taken the liberty of preparing some background information on each of the family members who were present in the house that night. I thought it might be helpful for your investigation. Miss Marple accepted the folder with a grateful nod. I do appreciate thoroughness, Captain. Now I wonder if it might be possible for me to view the scene of the tragedy. I find that rooms often tell stories that witnesses forget to mention. The morning room was exactly as Miss Marple had imagined it, from the descriptions she'd received. Elegant, comfortable, and now forever marked by violence. The outline of Lady Constance's body had been chalked on the Persian rug, a stark reminder that death had visited this peaceful space. But it was the tea service that commanded Miss Marple's attention. The silver teapot sat exactly where it had been found, its serpentine spout gleaming in the afternoon light. The inscription around its base was indeed as Captain Greystone had described, but Miss Marple noted something that apparently had escaped notice. The engraving was not uniform. Some letters appeared deeper and more recent than others, as if the original inscription had been modified or refreshed at some point in its history. Captain, she said, bending closer to examine the silver, do you know when this inscription was added? It seems to show signs of having been reworked. He joined her beside the tea cart, frowning at the teapot as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Now that you mention it, I seem to recall some family story about the inscription being altered, but I'm afraid the details escape me. Aunt Constance would have known, of course, but she was always rather cagey about family history. Said there were some stories better left buried. Miss Marple made a mental note to investigate the teapot's provenance more thoroughly. In her experience, when family heirlooms carried curses, there was usually a very specific reason, rooted in historical fact rather than supernatural fancy. The fact that someone had taken the trouble to alter the inscription suggested that the teapot story was more complex than a simple tale of sequential misfortune. She moved to the window and examined the latch, testing it gently. Was this window locked when the body was discovered? I believe so, yes. Whitmore is quite particular about security, especially on the ground floor. He checks all the latches personally each evening before retiring. And the door to the corridor? Closed, but not locked. Aunt Constance never liked locked doors within the house, said they made her feel trapped. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The physical evidence suggested an inside job, someone who knew the house's routines and had access to the morning room without needing to force their way in. Combined with the family tensions over the changing will, it painted a picture of a crime that was both carefully planned and desperately motivated. A soft knock at the morning room door interrupted her examination. Captain Greystone called for the visitor to enter, and a young woman stepped into the room. She was perhaps 30, with the sort of carelessly elegant appearance that spoke of good breeding and expensive education. Her dark hair was pinned back in a simple chignon, and she wore a black dress that managed to be both appropriately morning and undeniably stylish. "Uncle Nigel," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that might have been grief or nerves. "Mrs. Pemberton said you were showing Miss Marple the morning room. I was hoping I might have a word with her, if that's convenient." Captain Greystone made the introductions. "Miss Marple, this is my cousin Vivian Ashford, Lady Constance's niece. Vivian, Miss Marple has very kindly agreed to help us understand the circumstances surrounding your aunt's death." Vivian Ashford extended a gloved hand with the sort of practiced grace that suggested years of proper social training. But Miss Marple noticed that the gloves themselves were slightly shabby, mended at the fingertips with tiny, careful stitches that spoke of financial constraints. It was a small detail, but one that supported Captain Greystone's assertion that Vivian had been counting on her inheritance to solve pressing monetary problems. "Miss Marple," Vivian said, her voice now carefully controlled, "I wanted to speak with you because I'm afraid the police have formed quite the wrong impression about my relationship with Aunt Constance. They seem to think that I was angry about her plans to change the will, but nothing could be further from the truth. I supported her decision completely." "That's very interesting, Miss Ashford," Miss Marple replied gently. "It suggests a rather selfless attitude toward what must have been a considerable disappointment." Vivian's laugh was brittle. "Perhaps it does seem that way, but you have to understand, Aunt Constance wasn't simply being capricious. She had very good reasons for wanting to see the estate go to the National Trust. Reasons that had to do with family history and, well, certain obligations that she felt needed to be honored." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. "Obligations? I'm not certain I should say more," Vivian said, glancing nervously at Captain Greystone. "It's not really my story to tell, and Aunt Constance was very specific about keeping certain matters private until she could address them properly." "My dear," Miss Marple said in her kindliest voice, "your aunt is beyond being embarrassed by family revelations now, and if her death is connected to these mysterious obligations, keeping them secret won't serve her memory or bring her killer to justice." Vivian was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with divided loyalties. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. "Very well, but we should go somewhere more private. This isn't the sort of conversation to have standing over the spot where she died." They adjourned to the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that represented centuries of Greystone literary taste. A fire burned low in the massive stone fireplace, and the autumn afternoon light filtering through tall windows created a warm, intimate atmosphere that seemed to encourage confidences. Vivian settled herself in a wing-back chair and stared into the fire for several moments before beginning her story. "The thing about family curses, Miss Marple, is that they're often rooted in very real guilt. The Silver Teapot wasn't cursed by supernatural forces. It was a constant reminder of a terrible injustice that the family had never bothered to correct." She paused to pour herself a sherry from a decanter on a side table, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the glass. In 1832, the year before the Teapot's first recorded appearance, the Greystone family was involved in a scandal that was successfully covered up but never forgotten. The then Lord Greystone, Aunt Constance's great-great-grandfather, had seduced, abandoned a young woman from the village, When she bore his child and demanded recognition, he had her accused of theft and transported to the colonies. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady clicking. A sadly common story for those times, I'm afraid. Yes, but this story had a particularly cruel twist. The young woman, whose name was Sarah Hartwell, had actually been employed as a silversmith's assistant before her involvement with Lord Greystone. She was, by all accounts, extraordinarily talented at her craft. When she was transported, she was pregnant and penniless, but she managed to survive and eventually establish herself as a silversmith in Australia. Vivian took a sip of her sherry and continued. Before she died, Sarah Hartwell sent a package back to England, a silver teapot of her own creation, inscribed with what she meant as a curse upon the Greystone line. But here's where the story becomes truly interesting. The teapot that arrived was so beautiful, so exquisitely crafted, that Lord Greystone decided to keep it rather than destroy it. He even had the inscription altered to make it seem like a blessing rather than a curse. Altered how? Miss Marple asked. The original inscription read, "To the Greystone line, may this vessel bring bitterness to your unions and poison to your blood." But the family silversmith was instructed to change bitterness to sweetness and poison to strength. The problem was that he could never quite erase the original words completely, so if you knew where to look, you could still see traces of Sarah Hartwell's true message. Captain Greystone, who had been listening with growing amazement, leaned forward in his chair. "You're saying that the teapot was never blessed at all, that it was always meant as a curse?" "Exactly. And every time it was used for a family celebration, it was as if Sarah Hartwell's ghost was present, reminding everyone of the injustice that had never been acknowledged. Aunt Constance believed that the subsequent tragedies weren't supernatural at all, but psychological. Family members who knew the true story were unconsciously driven to self-destructive behavior by guilt and shame. Miss Marple found this explanation both plausible and deeply sad. And your aunt planned to make amends somehow. She had been researching Sarah Hartwell's descendants in Australia for months. She discovered that Sarah had founded quite a successful silversmithing business, but that her family had never known the true story of her transportation or the identity of the father of her child. Aunt Constance wanted to acknowledge the injustice publicly and provide for Sarah's descendants as a form of reparation, which would explain the changes to her will, Miss Marple mused. She planned to leave the estate to the National Trust with instructions that the proceeds be used to establish a foundation in Sarah Hartwell's name. Precisely. She was also planning to have the teapot's inscription restored to its original form and display the piece in a museum, with the full story of Sarah Hartwell's treatment by the family. It was a moving story, and one that cast Lady Constance's character in a far more sympathetic light than Miss Marple had initially expected. But it also provided clear motives for murder among family members who would see their inheritances disappear into historical justice and charitable works. "Miss Ashford," Miss Marple said gently, "I'm curious about your own reaction to these plans. You say you supported them, but surely you must have had some personal feelings about losing your inheritance." Vivian's smile was rueful. "I suppose I should be offended by the question, but given the circumstances, it's perfectly reasonable. The truth is, Miss Marple, that I had already made my peace with reduced expectations. My gambling debts, while substantial, are not insurmountable, and I had already arranged to take a position teaching at a girls' school in Scotland. The salary won't make me rich, but it will allow me to live respectably and pay off my obligations gradually." "And when did you make this arrangement?" 3 weeks ago. I wrote to Aunt Constance immediately to tell her about my change in circumstances and to assure her that she needn't feel obligated to provide for me in her will. She was delighted, as you might imagine, and told me about her plans for the foundation at that time. If Vivian's story was true, It removed her from the list of suspects with compelling financial motives. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that people's stated motivations and their actual feelings were often quite different things. A woman proud enough to teach school rather than beg for family support might also be proud enough to commit murder rather than admit to her desperate circumstances. As if reading her thoughts, Vivian reached into her handbag and produced a letter. "I thought you might want to verify my story, so I brought the correspondence with the school. You'll see that the arrangements were made well before Aunt Constance's death, and that my first month's salary was actually paid in advance to help with my travel expenses." Miss Marple examined the letters with interest. They appeared genuine, and the dates certainly supported Vivian's timeline, but she made a mental note to wire the school independently for confirmation. Trust was all very well, but verification was better when murder was involved. A commotion in the corridor outside the library interrupted their conversation. Voices were raised in what sounded like heated argument, and Captain Greystone excused himself to investigate. He returned a moment later, accompanied by a young man who was clearly agitated and more than slightly drunk. "Miss Marple, Captain," Greystone said with evident embarrassment, "I'd like you to meet my nephew, Timothy Greystone. Timothy, this is Miss Marple, who is helping us understand the circumstances of Aunt Constance's death." Timothy Greystone was perhaps 22, with the sort of careless good looks that suggested he'd never had to work very hard to make a favorable impression. His clothes were expensive but rumpled, his hair needed cutting, and there was a wildness in his eyes that spoke of grief mixed with panic. He swayed slightly as he offered Miss Marple an exaggerated bow. "Charmed, I'm sure," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Come to solve the mystery of the cursed teapot, have you? Well, let me save you some time. We're all guilty as sin. Every last one of us. Guilty of greed, guilty of selfishness, guilty of counting on an old woman's death to solve our problems." "Timothy," Vivian said sharply, "you're drunk and you're talking nonsense. Go sleep it off before you say something you'll regret." Timothy's laugh was bitter. "Regret? My dear cousin, I've moved far beyond regret into the realm of complete despair. Do you know what our sainted aunt told me when I went to see her yesterday morning? She said she'd found out about my little arrangement with Pemberton, and that she was not only cutting me out of the will, but considering turning me over to the police for theft." Captain Greystone went very still. "What arrangement with Pemberton?" Timothy collapsed into a chair and buried his face in his hands. "Nothing dramatic, Uncle. Just a small business arrangement where she helped me remove certain valuable items from the house over the past few months, and I shared the proceeds with her. A few pieces of silver here, some jewelry there. Nothing. That would be missed immediately." "You were stealing from Aunt Constance?" Vivian's voice was horrified. "I prefer to think of it as claiming my inheritance early," Timothy said with defiant self-pity. "She had more than she could ever use, and I had debts that couldn't wait for her natural demise. Mrs. Pemberton was going to lose her position anyway when the house went to the National Trust, so it seemed like a mutually beneficial arrangement." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with interest. "And Mrs. Pemberton was present when your aunt confronted you about this theft?" "Oh yes, she was there all right." Standing behind Aunt Constance like some sort of avenging angel, wringing her hands and claiming she'd only gone along with my scheme because she felt sorry for me. The hypocrite. It was her idea to target pieces that wouldn't be missed. Her suggestions about which dealers would ask the fewest questions. This revelation cast both Timothy and Mrs. Pemberton in a much more sinister light. Theft was one thing, but when the victim threatened exposure, it became a compelling motive for murder. Miss Marple made another mental note to examine the household, inventory more carefully, and to have a very thorough conversation with the housekeeper. "Timothy," Captain Greystone's voice was carefully controlled, "what exactly happened after Aunt Constance confronted you?" "She gave us both 24 hours, to return what we'd taken and make full restitution, or she would contact the police. She said she'd been planning to be generous in her bequests to long-serving staff, but that Mrs. Pemberton's betrayal had changed everything. She was going to dismiss her without a reference and ensure that she never worked in service again. And how did Mrs. Pemberton react to this threat? Timothy's laugh was hollow. How do you think? She went white as a sheet and started babbling about her age, about how impossible it would be to find new employment, about how she'd given her whole life to this family and deserved better. She even had the nerve to suggest that Aunt Constance was being unfair, that servants' wages were so low that they were practically forced to supplement their income. Miss Marple found this exchange fascinating for several reasons. It provided clear motives for both Timothy and Mrs. Pemberton, but it also suggested that Lady Constance had been conducting what amounted to a house-cleaning of her affairs before her death. First the will changes, then the teapot revelation, now the exposure of theft. It painted a picture of a woman determined to set all accounts straight before departing this world. "When did this confrontation take place?" she asked. "Yesterday morning around 10 o'clock. Aunt Constance had summoned us both to her private sitting room, and she laid out the whole business in that cold, precise way she had when she was truly angry. She showed us an inventory she'd been working on, with photographs and descriptions of everything that had gone missing. She'd been watching us for weeks, apparently, documenting our thefts with the thoroughness of a professional investigator. And after this meeting, Mrs. Pemberton went straight to her room and locked the door. I could hear her crying through the walls. As for me, I went to the village pub and proceeded to drink myself into a state where none of it seemed quite real. I only returned to the house around midnight, and I went straight to my room without speaking to anyone." Vivian leaned forward in her chair. "Timothy, are you saying that you were in the village all day? That you have witnesses to your whereabouts?" "Several. Dozen witnesses, I should think. The barkeeper, the serving girls, half the local farmers. I made quite a spectacle of myself, I'm afraid, ranting about family loyalty and the ingratitude of the older generation. Not my finest hour, but it does provide me with what I believe is called an alibi." Miss Marple made note of this claim, though she knew that alibis provided by village pubs were often more flexible than they initially appeared. Drunken young gentlemen were not uncommon sights in rural taprooms, and witnesses might easily confuse one evening with another, especially if incentivized to do so. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Pemberton herself, clearly, summoned by the sound of raised voices from the library. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with the sort of rigidly upright posture that suggested a lifetime of conscious dignity in the face of servitude. Her greying hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her black dress was impeccably clean and pressed despite the household's recent upheaval. "Captain Greystone," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I apologize for the interruption, but I wanted to inform you that Inspector Craddock has arrived and is requesting to speak with all members of the household. He's waiting in the morning room." The mention of the official police investigation seemed to sober Timothy considerably. He straightened in his chair and ran his hands through his disheveled hair in an attempt to make himself more presentable. "I suppose there's no avoiding it," he said, "though I can't imagine what more I can tell him than what I've already shared with you." Miss Marple rose from her chair and gathered her knitting. "Perhaps we should all speak with the inspector. Mrs. Pemberton, I wonder if I might have a word with you privately afterward. I'm particularly interested in your recollections of Lady Constance's final days." Mrs. Pemberton's face remained carefully composed, but Miss Marple noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. "Of course, miss. Though I'm not sure what I could tell you that would be of interest. Her ladyship was much the same as always in her final weeks." "Oh, I'm sure you're being modest," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. "In my experience, housekeepers see and understand far more about family dynamics than anyone gives them credit for. You must have observed the changes in Lady Constance's behavior as she prepared to alter her will. The group made their way back, so to the morning room, where Inspector Craddock was examining the tea service with the methodical attention of a man who had learned to distrust first impressions. He was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps 45, with the sort of carefully groomed appearance that suggested ambitions beyond rural police work. When Captain Greystone made the introductions, the inspector's reaction to Miss Marple's presence was a mixture of professional courtesy and poorly concealed skepticism. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a perfunctory handshake, "Captain Greystone mentioned that you might be able to provide some insight into the family dynamics here. I hope you understand that this is an active murder investigation, and I'll need to conduct formal interviews with all potential witnesses." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied. "I wouldn't dream of interfering with your investigation. I'm simply here as a friend of the family, hoping to provide whatever comfort I can during this difficult time." Inspector Craddock's expression suggested he found this explanation less than completely convincing, but he nodded politely and turned his attention to the assembled suspects. Miss Marple positioned herself unobtrusively in a corner chair, where she could observe both the inspector's questioning technique and the reactions of those being questioned. The inspector began with Captain Greystone establishing the basic timeline of discovery and the relationships between family members. His questions were thorough but predictable, covering alibis, motives, and access to the morning room. Captain Greystone's answers were precise and cooperative, though Miss Marple noted that he was careful not to volunteer information that hadn't been specifically requested. Timothy's interview was more dramatic, as he repeated his confession about the theft scheme with Mrs. Pemberton. Inspector Craddock's interest sharpened considerably at this revelation, and his questions became more pointed as he explored the timeline of Lady Constance's discovery of the thefts and her threats of prosecution. "Mr. Greystone," the inspector said, consulting his notebook, "you claim to have been at the Lamb and Flag public house from approximately 11 in the morning until past midnight. That's quite an extended drinking session, even for a young gentleman dealing with family disappointments." Timothy's face flushed. "I realize how it must sound, Inspector, but I was genuinely distraught. The thought of facing criminal charges, of bringing shame on the family name, it was more than I felt capable of handling soberly." "And you made no attempt to return to the house during this time? Not even to collect belongings or speak with other family members?" "None whatsoever. I was in no condition to face anyone, least of all Aunt Constance. I rather hoped that if I gave her time to cool down, she might reconsider her threats." Vivian's interview proceeded smoothly until Inspector Craddock began probing her gambling debts and her recent employment arrangements. Miss Marple was impressed by the inspector's thoroughness in exploring potential financial motives, but she noticed that he seemed to accept Vivian's explanations at face value, without the sort of skeptical questioning that had characterized his interview with Timothy. When Mrs. Pemberton's turn came, the atmosphere in the room grew noticeably tenser. The housekeeper maintained her composure admirably, but Miss Marple could see the strain in the set of her shoulders and the way she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Pemberton," Inspector Craddock began, "I understand that you've been with the Greystone family for many years. That must have made Lady Constance's discovery of your arrangement with Mr. Timothy particularly painful." "It was a betrayal of trust that I will regret for the rest of my life," Mrs. Pemberton replied, her voice steady but quiet. "I can offer no excuse except to say that I allowed my fears about my future security to override my better judgment." "Tell me about Lady Constance's reaction when she confronted you." Mrs. Pemberton was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with the memory. She was disappointed rather than angry, which somehow made it worse. She said she had trusted me with the care of her home and her possessions, and that I had violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Did she make specific threats about your employment or potential prosecution? She said I had 24 hours to make full restitution, and that she would then decide how to proceed. She mentioned the possibility of police involvement, but she also said she would consider my years of faithful service before making a final decision. Inspector Craddock made several notes before continuing. Mrs. Pemberton, I need you to account for your whereabouts yesterday evening and this morning. Please be as specific as possible. After the confrontation with her ladyship, I went to my room and remained there for the rest of the day. I was too upset to eat dinner, and I spent the evening going through my belongings and trying to calculate how I might raise the money to repay what I had taken. Did anyone see you during this time? Can anyone verify that you remained in your room? Mrs. Pemberton hesitated. I don't believe so. My room is in the servants' wing, and the other staff members were busy with their evening duties. I heard them moving about, but I don't think anyone actually saw me. And this morning? I rose early, as is my custom, and began preparing for the day. I was in the kitchen when I heard Whitmore screaming from the morning room. I ran to see what was wrong and found— She paused, visibly composing herself. I found her ladyship as you saw her. Miss Marple found Mrs. Pemberton's account plausible but incomplete. The housekeeper was clearly holding back details, probably from a mixture of genuine grief and fear of further incriminating herself. But there was something in her manner that suggested more complex emotions than simple guilt over theft and murder. Inspector Craddock concluded his interviews and announced that he would be conducting a more thorough search of the house and grounds. He also indicated that formal statements would be required from all household members and that no one should plan to leave the estate until the investigation was complete. As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Pemberton with her most reassuring smile. My dear, I wonder if you might show me the servants' quarters. I'm quite interested in the architecture of old houses, and I imagine the below-stairs areas have some fascinating historical details. Mrs. Pemberton looked surprised by the request, but nodded politely. Of course, miss, though I'm afraid there's nothing very grand about the servants' areas. They were built for function rather than beauty. The servants' wing was indeed more utilitarian than the public areas of the house, but it possessed a comfortable, lived-in quality that Miss Marple found appealing. Mrs. Pemberton's room was small but scrupulously clean, furnished with simple, sturdy pieces that spoke of decades of careful maintenance. What caught Miss Marple's attention, however, was the writing desk near the window, which was covered with papers that Mrs. Pemberton hastily tried to gather up. Please don't let me disturb your work, Miss Marple said gently. I imagine you have a great deal of correspondence to catch up on during such a difficult time. Mrs. Pemberton's hand stilled on the papers. It's nothing important, miss, just some personal business that needs attending to. But Miss Marple had caught sight of several official-looking documents, including what appeared to be property deeds and legal correspondence. One letter, partially visible beneath the others, bore the letterhead of a London law firm and contained phrases that suggested financial transactions of some complexity. Mrs. Pemberton, Miss Marple said, settling herself in a chair with her knitting, I hope you won't think me impertinent, but I sense that you're carrying a burden that goes beyond the theft issue with young Timothy. Sometimes sharing our troubles can help clarify our thinking. The housekeeper sank into a chair opposite Miss Marple, and for the first time since their introduction, her composed facade cracked slightly. You're very perceptive, miss. The truth is, the situation with Master Timothy was more complicated than I've indicated to the inspector. In what way? Mrs. Pemberton glanced toward the door, ensuring their privacy, before continuing in a lowered voice. The theft scheme wasn't Master Timothy's idea originally. It was mine. Miss Marple's knitting. Needles paused. I see. You have to understand, miss, I've worked for this family for 37 years. I've given them my whole life, and I had been promised security in my old age. When I learned about her ladyship's plans to donate the estate to the National Trust, I panicked. I'm 63 years old with no family of my own, and very little in the way of savings. The thought of being turned out to find new employment at my age was terrifying. So you suggested to Timothy that he might claim some of his inheritance early? Exactly. He was already in financial difficulties, and I thought that if we were careful, we could supplement both our situations without causing real harm. Her ladyship had so many valuable pieces that hadn't been used in years, I convinced myself that she would never miss them. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, allowing the rhythm to encourage further confession. But something went wrong with your plan. Her ladyship was far more observant than I'd given her credit for. She had been keeping detailed inventories of the house contents as part of her preparations for the National Trust donation. When pieces started disappearing, she noticed immediately and began investigating. And when she confronted you both yesterday morning? Mrs. Pemberton's composure finally broke completely. She was so disappointed, miss. She said she had trusted me like family, and that I had repaid that trust with betrayal. But then she said something that made everything even worse. What was that? She said she had been planning to provide generously for me in her will, even with the estate going to the trust. She had intended to leave me enough money to buy a cottage and live comfortably for the rest of my life. But my theft had changed her mind about my character, and she was no longer sure I could be trusted with such a bequest. The irony was both tragic and telling. Mrs. Pemberton had stolen because she feared poverty, but her theft had guaranteed the very outcome she'd been trying to avoid. It was exactly the sort of self-defeating behavior that Miss Marple had observed countless times in people driven by desperation and poor judgment. Mrs. Pemberton, Miss Marple said gently, what did you do after Lady Constance dismissed you from that meeting? I came back to my room and spent the afternoon going through her ladyship's papers, the household accounts, the inventory lists, anything that might help me understand the full extent of what I'd lost. That's when I found these. She gestured toward the papers on her desk. Miss Marple examined the documents with interest. They included correspondence with the National Trust, preliminary architectural surveys of the house, and most intriguingly, a draft will that showed Lady Constance's original intentions for her staff's bequests. According to the document, Mrs. Pemberton would have received £10,000 and a cottage on the estate, a very comfortable provision for her retirement years. But there was another document that caught Miss Marple's attention. A letter from Lady Constance to a law firm in Australia, requesting assistance in tracing the descendants of one Sarah Hartwell. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Lady Constance's death and contained specific references to making amends for historical injustices and establishing a foundation to honor Miss Hartwell's memory and support her descendants. Mrs. Pemberton, Miss Marple said, did Lady Constance ever discuss her research into family history with you, particularly anything relating to the Silver Teapot or events from the 1830s? The housekeeper looked surprised by the question. She had been spending a great deal of time in the family archives recently, miss. She said she was researching the provenance of various pieces for the National Trust donation, but she seemed particularly interested in the silver collection. She had me bring up several pieces from the vault for examination, including that teapot. Did she share any of her discoveries with you? Not directly, but I couldn't help noticing that she seemed quite agitated about something she'd found. She made several trips to London to consult with experts at the British Museum, and she received a good deal of correspondence from Australia. She also had the teapot examined by a specialist who could analyze the inscriptions in detail. This confirmed Vivian's story about Lady Constance's plans to make amends for historical wrongs, but it also suggested that Lady Constance's research had uncovered information that went beyond what she'd shared with her niece. Miss Marple made a mental note to examine the family archives more thoroughly. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said, "I need to ask you directly. After Lady Constance confronted you about the theft, did you have any further contact with her before her death?" The housekeeper was quiet for so long that Miss Marple began to think she wouldn't answer. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Yes, miss. I went to see her in the morning room yesterday evening, around 9 o'clock. I wanted to apologize properly and to beg her to reconsider her decision about my employment." "And how did she respond?" "She was kinder than I deserved, miss. She said she understood that fear had driven me to theft, and that she didn't hate me for what I'd done. But she also said that trust, once broken, was very difficult to repair. She needed time to think about how to proceed." "Was anyone else present during this conversation?" "No, miss. We were alone in the morning room. That's when she told me about her plans for the foundation and why she felt obligated to donate the estate to the National Trust. She said the Greystone family had profited for too long from an injustice and that it was time to balance the scales." Miss Marple found this conversation fascinating for several reasons. It suggested that Lady Constance had been more philosophical than vindictive about the theft, which seemed inconsistent with Timothy's account of her threats. It also confirmed that she had been alone in the morning room at least once on the evening before her death, establishing a precedent for her early morning tea ritual. "Mrs. Pemberton, did Lady Constance say anything about expecting visitors the next morning?" "She mentioned that she had some family business to attend to, and that she would be taking her morning tea in the morning room rather than her private sitting room. She asked me to prepare the silver service and to ensure that she wouldn't be disturbed before 10 o'clock. "Did she specify who she was expecting?" "No, miss, but she seemed quite pleased about something. She said that she hoped to have good news to share with the family by the end of the week." This detail added another layer of complexity to the case. Lady Constance had clearly been planning something significant for the morning of her death, something that had given her considerable satisfaction. The fact that she had requested the cursed teapot specifically suggested that her plans were connected to the family history research and her intended amends to Sarah Hartwell's descendants. Knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Captain Greystone appeared, looking somewhat harried. "Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock is looking for you. He said he'd like to speak with you before he returns to the village." Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose from her chair. "Of course. Mrs. Pemberton, thank you for being so candid with me. I hope you'll continue to be completely honest with the inspector. It's the only way to ensure that justice is done for Lady Constance." Inspector Craddock was waiting in the library, making notes while he reviewed the statements he'd collected. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, and she could see that the day's interviews had left him both frustrated and intrigued. "Miss Marple," he said, "I understand you've been conducting some informal interviews of your own. I hope you appreciate that witness statements need to be collected through proper channels to be admissible in court." "Naturally, Inspector," Miss Marple replied. "I've simply been offering a sympathetic ear to people who are grieving and confused. Sometimes people find it easier to share their thoughts with someone who isn't carrying handcuffs." Inspector Craddock's smile was rueful. "Fair point. And I have to admit, your presence seems to have loosened some tongues that might otherwise have remained sealed." Mrs. Pemberton's admission about initiating the theft scheme was particularly illuminating. "Yes, it does provide a clear motive for both her and young Timothy. Though I wonder if you've considered whether the theft issue might be secondary to other family concerns." "Such as?" Miss Marple settled herself in a comfortable chair and arranged her knitting in her lap. "Well, Inspector, it seems that Lady Constance had been conducting quite extensive research into family history, particularly relating to events in the 1830s. She had apparently uncovered some information that made her feel obligated to make significant reparations. Inspector Craddock consulted his notebook. "You're referring to the business about the Silver Teapot and this Sarah Hartwell person?" "I have to say, Miss Marple, that strikes me as rather fanciful motivation for murder in 1954. Perhaps, but consider the practical implications. Lady Constance's plans to donate the estate to the National Trust and establish a foundation for Sarah Hartwell's descendants would have left very little for family members who had been counting on substantial inheritances. That's a much more immediate motive than historical guilt. True, but we also have to consider the physical evidence. The victim was struck from behind with considerable force, suggesting either a moment of uncontrolled rage or premeditated murder by someone strong enough to ensure a fatal blow. Mrs. Pemberton, while she certainly had motive, is 63, years old and not particularly robust. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, the physical aspects of the crime are quite important. Have you had an opportunity to examine the weapon more closely? The poker appears to be a standard brass fireplace tool, quite heavy and certainly capable of inflicting the fatal injury. There were no clear fingerprints, but that's not surprising given that it's a household implement that would be handled regularly by staff members. And the tea service itself. Clean as a whistle, I'm afraid. If the killer handled any of the pieces, they were careful to wipe them clean afterward. Though I did notice something odd about the inscription on the teapot. It appears to have been altered at some point, though I can't make out what the original wording might have been." Miss Marple's needles clicked with satisfaction. "That's a very astute observation, Inspector. The teapot's history is indeed more complex than it initially appears. I wonder if you've had a chance to examine Lady Constance's correspondence with Australia." "I have, and it's quite extensive. She had been in contact with several genealogical researchers and had apparently located at least 3 families who appear to be descended from this Sarah Hartwell. She was also working with lawyers in Sydney to establish the legal framework for a charitable foundation. Expensive undertakings, I should imagine. Quite expensive, yes. According to her financial records, she had already spent several £1,000s on research and legal fees, with much more committed to the foundation if her plans proceeded." Miss Marple found this detail particularly significant. Lady Constance's historical research hadn't been merely academic. She had been preparing to spend substantial sums to make amends for her family's past behavior. For family members facing reduced inheritances, this would have represented money literally being thrown away on strangers in Australia. "Inspector," she said, "I wonder if you've considered the timing of Lady Constance's death in relation to her various projects. From what I've learned, she was on the verge of finalizing both her will changes and her foundation plans. If someone wanted to prevent these arrangements, they would have had to act quickly. That's certainly one theory, but it requires us to believe that a family member was willing to commit murder over inheritances that were at best expectations rather than legal rights." "Oh, Inspector," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile, "I've found that people are capable of extraordinary behavior when their expectations are threatened. Pride, fear, and greed are powerful motivators, often more powerful than love or loyalty." Inspector Craddock closed his notebook and rose from his chair. "Well, Miss Marple, I appreciate your insights, but I'm afraid I'll need more than psychological theories to make an arrest. I'm returning to the village this evening, but I'll be back tomorrow to conduct more detailed searches and follow up on alibis. I trust you'll be available if I need to speak with you further." "Naturally, Inspector. I plan to remain at Greystone Manor until the funeral at minimum. Captain Greystone has been most hospitable." After the inspector departed, Miss Marple found herself alone in the library with her thoughts and her knitting. The case presented several intriguing possibilities, but she felt that she was still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. The physical evidence was limited, the motives were multiple and complex, and the alibis were either non-existent or difficult to verify. What bothered her most was the sense that Lady Constance's death had been carefully planned rather than the result of a moment of passion. The killer had chosen the morning room specifically, had arranged for the victim to be alone at a predictable time, and had taken care to clean up after the crime. This suggested premeditation and calculation rather than desperate improvisation. She was still pondering these questions when Vivian appeared in the library doorway, looking pale and anxious. "Miss Marple, I was hoping I might speak with you privately. I'm afraid I may have misled you earlier about my relationship with Aunt Constance." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gestured to a chair near the fire. "Please sit down, my dear. What did you want to tell me?" Vivian settled herself with obvious nervousness, clasping and unclasping her hands as she struggled to find the right words. "It's about my gambling debts. While it's true that I had arranged to take a teaching position and that I had written to Aunt Constance about my changed circumstances, I wasn't entirely honest about my motivations." "In what way?" "The truth is, Miss Marple, that my debts were far more serious than I indicated. I didn't just owe money to bookmakers and casinos. I had borrowed money from some rather unsavory people in London, people who don't accept teaching salaries as adequate repayment schedules." Miss Marple felt a familiar chill of recognition. She had encountered this sort of desperate situation before, where gambling addiction led to borrowing from criminal sources who used violence to ensure collection. "How much money are we talking about, Miss Ashford?" "Nearly £3,000, Vivian said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know it sounds impossible, but it accumulated so quickly. First I was just trying to win back what I'd lost. Then I was trying to pay off the original debts. Then I was borrowing just to make the interest payments. And these unsavory creditors were applying pressure." Vivian nodded miserably. "They made it quite clear that my health and safety depended on making substantial payments by the end of this month. The teaching position would have provided me with respectability and a steady income, but it wouldn't have generated enough money quickly enough to satisfy my immediate obligations." This revelation cast Vivian's earlier protestations about supporting Aunt Constance's will changes in a very different light. A woman facing physical violence from criminal creditors might well say anything to deflect suspicion while desperately seeking access to her inheritance. "Miss Ashford," Miss Marple said gently, "when you wrote to your aunt about your teaching arrangements, did you also discuss your debt situation with her?" "Not directly, but I think she may have suspected something. She asked very pointed questions about my financial circumstances and whether I was in any sort of trouble that might require immediate assistance. I assured her that everything was manageable, but I'm not sure she believed me." "And her response?" "She said that if I ever needed help, I should come to her directly rather than trying to handle things on my own. She also mentioned that she was reviewing her will and wanted to ensure that family members who were struggling received appropriate support." Miss Marple found this exchange particularly interesting because it suggested that Lady Constance had been aware of Vivian's difficulties and might have been planning to provide assistance despite her public statements about reducing family bequests. It also meant that Vivian had reasons to hope for financial rescue that went beyond the general expectation of inheritance. "Miss Ashford, I need to ask you directly. After you arrived at Greystone Manor, did you have any private conversations with your aunt about your debt situation?" Vivian was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the decision of whether to reveal more details. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Yes, I did. On the evening before her death, I went to her private sitting room and told her everything. The gambling, the debts, the threats from my creditors. I was desperate, Miss Marple. I couldn't see any other way out." "And how did she respond?" "She was disappointed but not surprised. She said she had suspected that something was driving my recent behavior, and that she was glad I had finally been honest with her. She promised to help me, but she said she needed time to figure out how to do so without enabling further gambling. Did she make any specific commitments? She said she would pay off my immediate debts to keep me safe, but that any further assistance would be contingent on my getting proper treatment for my gambling addiction. She also said that she wanted to involve Uncle Nigel in the solution, since he had military experience dealing with men who had developed destructive habits. This conversation provided yet another motive for murder. If Lady Constance had been planning to help Vivian immediately, her death would have cut off that assistance and left Vivian facing her criminal creditors with no resources and no protector. But it also suggested that Vivian had more to gain from keeping Lady Constance alive than from killing her. Miss Ashford, Miss Marple said, "What were your specific movements yesterday evening and this morning? I know the inspector asked you this already, but I'd like to hear the details again." After my conversation with Aunt Constance, I went to my room and remained there for the rest of the evening. I was too emotionally exhausted to eat dinner or socialize with the rest of the family. I fell asleep quite early and didn't wake until I heard the commotion from the morning room. Did anyone see you during this time? I don't think so. My room is in the guest wing and I didn't encounter any staff members or family members after I left Aunt Constance's sitting room around 8 o'clock. Miss Marple made note of another unverifiable alibi. The case was developing, a frustrating pattern where all the potential suspects claimed to have been alone during the crucial time period, with no witnesses to confirm their whereabouts. It was almost as if the killer had deliberately chosen a household where everyone would have equal opportunity and equal lack of alibi. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car approaching the house. Through the library windows, Miss Marple could see a taxi pulling up to the front entrance. A moment later, Captain Greystone appeared with a young man who appeared to be in his early 30s, well-dressed and carrying himself with the sort of confidence that suggested professional success. "Miss Marple, Miss Ashford," Captain Greystone said as they entered the library. "I'd like you to meet Dr. James Hartwell, who has just arrived from London. Dr. Hartwell, this is Miss Jane Marple, who is assisting us with some family matters, and my cousin, Vivian Ashford." The name Hartwell immediately captured Miss Marple's attention, and she studied the young man with interest. He bore no obvious resemblance to the portraits of Greystone family members that adorn the walls, but there was something in his bearing and manner that suggested good breeding and education. Dr. Hartwell shook hands with both ladies, his manner polite but obviously constrained by the circumstances of his visit. "I apologize for arriving at such a difficult time," he said. "I only learned about Lady Constance's death from the newspaper this morning, but I felt I had to come immediately." Captain Greystone looked puzzled. "Forgive me, Dr. Hartwell, but I don't believe we've met before. Are you a family connection of some sort?" Dr. Hartwell's smile was rueful. "In a manner of speaking, yes. I'm a descendant of Sarah Hartwell, the woman who created your family's Silver Teapot in 1833. Lady Constance had been corresponding with my family for several months about establishing a foundation in Sarah's memory." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Miss Marple could see the shock and recognition dawning on the faces of both Captain Greystone and Vivian as they realized they were meeting a direct descendant of the woman whose story had been driving Lady Constance's recent decisions. "My God," Captain Greystone said finally, "you're one of the Australian descendants that Aunt Constance had been researching." "Actually, no," Dr. Hartwell corrected gently. "My branch of the family never left England. Sarah Hartwell had a sister, Mary, who remained in Yorkshire and eventually married a local farmer named Hartwell. I'm descended from Mary, not from Sarah herself, but Lady Constance felt that all of Sarah's relatives deserved to know the true story of what happened to her." Miss Marple found this development absolutely fascinating. Lady Constance hadn't just been corresponding with distant relatives in Australia. She had been in contact with Sarah Hartwell's descendants, who lived much closer to home. It suggested that her plans for making amends were even more extensive than anyone had realized. "Dr. Hartwell," she said, "may I ask what Lady Constance had told you about her plans for the foundation?" She explained the full history of Sarah's treatment by the Greystone family and her subsequent transportation to Australia. She also shared her belief that the family had profited from an injustice for over a century and that it was time to make meaningful reparations to Sarah's descendants. "And your family's reaction to these revelations?" Dr. Hartwell's expression grew more serious. "Naturally, we were shocked to learn the true story of Sarah's fate. Family tradition had always held that she had emigrated voluntarily to seek better opportunities, not that she had been falsely accused of theft and transported as a criminal. But we were also deeply moved by Lady Constance's desire to make amends." Vivian leaned forward in her chair. "Dr. Hartwell, when did you last communicate with my aunt?" "Just 3 days ago, actually. She telephoned me to say that she had finalized the legal arrangements for the foundation and wanted to invite me to Greystone Manor to discuss the details in person. We arranged that I would come for morning tea yesterday to review the foundation documents and to see the silver teapot that Sarah had created." Miss Marple's knitting needles stopped their steady rhythm. "You were supposed to have morning tea with Lady Constance yesterday?" "That's correct. She was quite excited about the meeting and mentioned that she had some additional information about Sarah that she wanted to share with me. But when I arrived at the house around 9 o'clock yesterday morning, I was told that Lady Constance was indisposed and couldn't see visitors." Captain Greystone looked bewildered. "Who told you that?" "I wasn't aware that anyone had turned away visitors yesterday. It was the butler, a thin, nervous gentleman. He seemed quite agitated and insisted that Lady Constance was not receiving anyone. He suggested that I return another day, but given the circumstances of my visit, I decided to take a room at the village inn and wait to see if her condition improved." Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle that indicated a crucial piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Dr. Hartwell had been the mystery guest that Lady Constance was expecting for morning tea, the person for whom the second cup and saucer had been prepared. But according to his account, Whitmore the butler had turned him away, claiming that Lady Constance was indisposed. "Dr. Hartwell," she said carefully, "what time exactly did you arrive at the house yesterday morning?" "Just before 9 o'clock. I'd taken the early train from London and hired a taxi from the village station. I was quite punctual because Lady Constance had stressed the importance of timing for our meeting." "And you spoke only with the butler?" "That's correct. He answered the door personally and seemed very definite that I couldn't be admitted. He didn't offer to take a message or suggest an alternative time for the meeting." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful look with Captain Greystone. Whitmore's behavior in turning away Dr. Hartwell was highly irregular, especially given that Lady Constance had been expecting him and had specifically prepared the silver tea service for their meeting. It suggested either that the butler had been acting on Lady Constance's instructions to cancel the appointment, or that he had taken it upon himself to prevent the meeting for reasons of his own. "Captain Greystone," Miss Marple said, "I think we need to have a very serious conversation with Whitmore. His failure to mention Dr. Hartwell's visit to either Inspector Craddock or to us represents a significant omission in his account of yesterday's events." Dr. Hartwell looked concerned. "I hope I haven't created additional complications by coming forward now. I only learned about Lady Constance's death from this morning's newspaper, and I felt obligated to pay my respects and to express my family's gratitude for her efforts on Sarah's behalf." "On the contrary," Miss Marple assured him, "your information may be crucial to understanding what happened to Lady Constance. Captain Greystone, where might we find Whitmore at this hour?" "He's probably in the butler's pantry, preparing for the evening meal service." Though I should warn you, Miss Marple, that Whitmore has been in an extremely fragile state since discovering Aunt Constance's body. He may not be entirely coherent. They found Whitmore exactly where Captain Greystone had predicted, methodically, polishing silver in the butler's pantry, with the sort of obsessive attention to detail that suggested a mind-seeking refuge in familiar routine. He was a man of perhaps 70, thin to the point of gauntness, with white hair and the sort of pale indoor complexion that spoke of a lifetime spent in service. His hands shook as he worked, and Miss Marple noticed that he started violently. When they entered the room, "Whitmore," Captain Greystone said gently, "I'd like you to meet Dr. James Hartwell, who was a friend of Lady Constance's. He has some questions about yesterday morning that might help us understand what happened to her." Whitmore's reaction to Dr. Hartwell's presence was immediate and dramatic. The piece of silver he was polishing clattered to the floor, and his face went white as parchment. "You," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "you came back. I told you she couldn't see anyone. I told you to go away." Dr. Hartwell stepped forward with concern. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not here to cause trouble. I simply want to understand why Lady Constance was unable to keep our appointment yesterday morning." Whitmore's eyes darted frantically between Dr. Hartwell and the other visitors, as if seeking an escape route. "She was indisposed," he said, repeating the same phrase he had used the day before. "Very indisposed, not receiving visitors. I did what I had to do." Miss Marple moved closer, her voice gentle but insistent. "Whitmore, Dr. Hartwell was invited by Lady Constance specifically for morning tea. She had prepared the silver service and was expecting him. Why did you turn him away?" The butler's composure finally cracked completely. "Because I knew," he said, his voice rising to a near wail. "I knew what she was planning, and I couldn't let it happen. 37 years I've served this family, 37 years of loyalty and devotion, and she was going to throw it all away for strangers." Captain Greystone exchanged alarmed glances with Miss Marple. "Whitmore, what exactly did you know about Lady Constance's plans?" "Everything," Whitmore said bitterly. "I heard her telephone conversations. I saw the correspondence. I watched her getting more and more excited about giving away the family fortune to people who had no right to it, people who were already dead and buried. Sarah Hartwell's descendants have every right to know their family history," Dr. Hartwell said quietly. Whitmore turned on him with sudden venom. "Right? What right?" "Sarah Hartwell was a thief and a strumpet who got exactly what she deserved. The family covered up her crimes out of Christian charity, and this is how they're repaid, with demands for money and apologies for things that happened over a century ago." Miss Marple felt pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves in her mind. Whitmore's fierce loyalty to the Greystone family and his obvious resentment toward outsiders who threatened the established order suggested a motive that went beyond personal financial gain. "Whitmore," she said carefully, "when you turned Dr. Hartwell away yesterday morning, did you tell Lady Constance that he had come to call?" The butler was silent for a long moment, his hands working convulsively at the silver polishing cloth. Finally he shook his head. "No, I couldn't. She would have been so angry with me, and she was already angry enough about other things. Other things. The business with Mrs. Pemberton and Master Timothy. She had been ranting about betrayal and dishonesty, about how she couldn't trust anyone in her own household. I thought if she knew I had turned away her visitor without permission, she might dismiss me as well." Captain Greystone's voice was stern. "Whitmore, you do realize that your actions may have contributed to Aunt Constance's death. If she was expecting Dr. Hartwell and he never appeared, she might have been confused or upset in ways that made her vulnerable to attack." Whitmore's face crumpled. "I never meant for anything to happen to her. I just thought that if I delayed the meeting, if I gave myself time to think of a way to make her see reason, I might be able to save the family from making a terrible mistake. But you didn't delay the meeting, Miss Marple pointed out. You prevented it entirely. Lady Constance prepared the silver service and waited in the morning room for a guest who never came because you had turned him away without her knowledge. The full implications of his actions seemed to dawn on Whitmore for the first time. He staggered backward and collapsed into a chair, his face the color of old ash. "Dear God," he whispered. "What have I done?" Dr. Hartwell looked genuinely distressed by the butler's obvious anguish. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not here to destroy anyone's family or to cause financial hardship. Lady Constance contacted my family because she wanted to right a historical wrong, not because we were demanding anything from her." "But don't you see?" Whitmore said desperately. "Once the story gets out, once people know the truth about what happened to Sarah Hartwell, there will be others. Other descendants, other claims, other demands for compensation. The family will be bled dry by people seeking reparations for ancient grievances." Miss Marple found Whitmore's fears both understandable and tragically misguided. His devotion to the Greystone family was genuine, but it had led him to make decisions that ultimately contributed to the very disaster he was trying to prevent. "Whitmore," she said, "after you turned Dr. Hartwell away, what did you do for the rest of the morning?" "I went back to my duties," he replied mechanically. "I served breakfast to the family members who were present. I supervised the housemaids in their morning cleaning. I reviewed the day's schedule with Mrs. Pemberton, the usual routine." "And you didn't check on Lady Constance or wonder why she was remaining in the morning room for so long?" Whitmore's hands began to shake more violently. "I assumed I thought she might be writing letters or reviewing her papers. She had been spending a great deal of time lately working on correspondence, especially letters to Australia. I didn't want to disturb her." Miss Marple sensed there was more to Whitmore's story than he was revealing. His extreme nervousness and his reluctance to check on Lady Constance suggested either guilt about his deception or knowledge of something more serious than a missed appointment. "Whitmore," she said gently, "when you discovered Lady Constance's body this morning, you immediately began talking about the curse of the Silver Teapot. Why did your mind go there specifically?" The butler's laugh was hollow and bitter. "Because I knew the teapot was evil, miss. I've seen what it does to this family every time it's brought out. Death and disaster, always death and disaster. I begged her ladyship not to use it for her meeting with that man, but she insisted. She said it was symbolic, that it was time to face the truth about the family's past." "So you knew Lady Constance was planning to show the teapot to Dr. Hartwell?" "She had it polished specially for the occasion. She said she wanted him to see Sarah Hartwell's craftsmanship and to understand the irony of the family using a cursed object as if it were a blessing. She thought it was poetic justice." This detail provided another insight into Lady Constance's character. Her decision to serve tea from Sarah Hartwell's creation while discussing reparations to Sarah's family showed both a sense of historical symmetry and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. It also suggested that she had been planning a dramatic revelation rather than a simple business meeting. Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. "If I might ask, what exactly was the original inscription on the teapot? Lady Constance mentioned in her letters that it had been altered by the family, but she didn't provide the specific details." Whitmore looked at him with something approaching hatred. "You want to know, you really want to know what that woman wrote to curse this family? The original inscription said, 'To the Greystone line, may this vessel bring bitterness to your unions and poison to your blood.' Every word was meant to cause harm, every letter was crafted with malice. And yet," Miss Marple observed, "the family kept the teapot and used it for their most important celebrations. That suggests either remarkable faith in their ability to transform a curse into a blessing, or a complete lack of understanding about its true origins." They were fools, Whitmore said flatly. Generation after generation of fools who thought they could ignore the past and escape the consequences of their actions. But the curse always found them in the end. Always. Miss Marple was beginning to form a theory about Whitmore's role in the tragedy, but she needed more information before drawing final conclusions. Whitmore, after the family retired for the evening yesterday, did you make your usual rounds of the house to check the locks and secure the building? Of course. I've done the same routine every night for 37 years, every door, every window, every possible point of entry. Her ladyship insisted on proper security, especially in recent years. And everything was secure when you completed. Your rounds? Whitmore hesitated. Yes, everything was locked properly, though I did notice that the light was still on in the morning room. Her ladyship sometimes worked late, so I didn't think anything of it at the time. Did you check on her? No, miss. She had given specific instructions that she was not to be disturbed after 9 o'clock. She said she had important thinking to do and needed absolute privacy. Miss Marple found this detail particularly significant. If Lady Constance had been alive and working in the morning room when Whitmore made his rounds, it narrowed the time frame for the murder considerably. It also suggested that the killer had either been hiding in the house during Whitmore's security check or had gained access after the building was secured. Whitmore, Captain Greystone said, his voice carefully controlled, I need you to think very carefully about this next question. During your security rounds last evening, did you encounter anyone else in the house? Any family members or staff? Who were still awake and moving about? The butler's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, concentration, and finally a dawning horror that suggested he was remembering something significant. There was someone, he said slowly. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside the morning room, but when I looked, no one was there. I assumed it was her ladyship moving about, perhaps going to fetch something from another room. What time was this? Around 9:30, I think. Just as I was finishing my rounds and preparing to retire to my own quarters. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Whitmore, these footsteps you heard, were they the sort of footsteps Lady Constance would make? Did they sound like her? Usual gait and manner of walking? Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, clearly replaying the memory in his mind. Now that you mention it, miss, they seemed heavier than her ladyship's usual step, and quicker, as if someone was moving with purpose rather than simply wandering about. But you didn't investigate further. I called out to ask if everything was all right, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped, and everything went quiet. I assumed whoever it was had gone back to their room. Dr. Hartwell had been listening to this exchange with growing concern. Mr. Whitmore, do you think it's possible that someone was in the morning room with Lady Constance when you heard those footsteps? Someone who shouldn't have been there? Whitmore's hands began to tremble again. I don't know, sir. I truly don't know. I've been trying not to think about it, but the possibility has been haunting me all day. Miss Marple rose from her chair and began to pace slowly around the butler's pantry, her knitting forgotten, as she worked through the implications of Whitmore's revelations. The picture that was emerging suggested a carefully planned crime that had taken advantage of the household's routines and the killer's intimate knowledge of the family's habits. Captain Greystone, she said finally, I think we need to gather everyone together for a family meeting. There are several aspects of this case that require clarification, and I believe that a direct confrontation may be the only way to get to the truth. You mean you know who killed Aunt Constance? I have a theory, Miss Marple replied carefully. But theories require proof, and proof often emerges only when the guilty party is faced with the impossibility of maintaining their deception. Doctor, Hartwell looked alarmed. Are you suggesting that the killer is still in the house? That we've been in the presence of Lady Constance's murderer all day? I'm afraid that's exactly what I'm suggesting, Dr. Hartwell. And I believe that person is becoming increasingly desperate as the investigation progresses. That makes them both more dangerous and more likely to make mistakes. Captain Greystone's military training was evident in his immediate response. Right then, I'll gather everyone in the library within the hour. Whitmore, you'll need to be there as well, despite your condition. Miss Marple, do you need any additional information or assistance before we proceed? Just one thing, Miss Marple said. I'd like to examine Lady Constance's private papers, particularly her correspondence about the Foundation and any personal notes she may have made about family members. Sometimes people reveal their true intentions in private writings in ways they never would in person. Lady Constance's private sitting room was a testament to a life spent in careful observation and meticulous record-keeping. Her desk was organized with military precision, every document filed and catalogued with obsessive attention to detail. Miss Marple was particularly interested in a leather-bound journal that appeared to contain Lady Constance's private thoughts about family matters and her plans for the future. The journal entries from the final weeks of Lady Constance's life painted a picture of a woman who was both excited about her historical discoveries and increasingly concerned about the reactions of her family members. She had clearly been aware that her plans would cause disappointment and resentment, but she had been determined to proceed regardless of the personal cost. One entry, dated just 3 days before her death, was particularly revealing. I know that my decision to establish the Sarah Hartwell Foundation will be seen as a betrayal by family members who have counted on inheriting the estate. But I cannot continue to profit from an injustice, no matter how ancient. The curse of the Silver Teapot is not supernatural. It is the weight of unacknowledged guilt that has poisoned this family for generations. Only by making proper amends can we hope to break free from the cycle of tragedy. Another entry, from the day before her death, contained an observation that made Miss Marple's pulse quicken. I am beginning to suspect that someone in the household has been reading my private correspondence. Several letters have been moved, slightly from their original positions, and I have the distinct feeling that my telephone conversations are being overheard. If someone is planning to interfere with my meeting with Dr. Hartwell tomorrow, I must be prepared to protect both him and the Foundation documents. The final entry was brief, but ominous. I have decided to move the Foundation papers to the bank vault this afternoon for safekeeping. If something should happen to me before the legal arrangements are complete, I want to ensure that Sarah Hartwell's story is not buried again. I have also written letters to Dr. Hartwell and to the National Trust explaining my full intentions, to be opened in the event of my death. Miss Marple sat back in Lady Constance's chair and considered the implications of these journal entries. Lady Constance had been aware that someone was monitoring her activities and had taken steps to protect her plans from interference. The fact that she had felt the need to move important documents to safety suggested that she had been genuinely concerned about sabotage or worse. But the most significant detail was her mention of letters to be opened in the event of her death. If such letters existed, they might contain crucial information about Lady Constance's suspicions regarding potential threats to her safety. A search of the desk drawers revealed the copies of 2 letters, both dated the day before the murder. The first was addressed to Dr. Hartwell and contained detailed instructions about how to proceed with the Foundation if Lady Constance should die before the legal arrangements were complete. The second was addressed to the National Trust and provided a comprehensive history of the Sarah Hartwell case, along with Lady Constance's reasons for donating the estate. But there was a third letter, this one unsent and apparently written in haste, that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was addressed to Inspector Craddock at the local police station and dated the evening before Lady Constance's death. Dear Inspector Craddock, I am writing to inform you that I have reason to believe Someone in my household may be planning to interfere with important family business that I intend to conclude tomorrow morning. While I have no concrete evidence of a specific threat, I have noticed several disturbing signs that suggest my private affairs are being monitored and that there may be an attempt to prevent me from meeting with an important visitor. If anything should happen to me, I want you to know that Dr. James Hartwell was scheduled to visit me at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to discuss a charitable foundation I'm establishing. I also want you to know that I have been receiving anonymous letters warning me against betraying family interests and urging me to reconsider my plans for the estate. I have kept these letters in my desk drawer for your reference should the need arise. I pray that I am being unnecessarily cautious, but recent events have made me increasingly concerned about the lengths to which desperate people might go to protect their expectations. Miss Marple searched the desk drawers frantically until she found a small bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. The anonymous letters were exactly as Lady Constance had described, threats couched in formal language, but unmistakably menacing in their intent. The handwriting was disguised, but the paper was expensive, and the vocabulary suggested an educated writer. The letters escalated in tone from gentle persuasion to explicit threats. The final letter, received just 2 days before Lady Constance's death, was particularly chilling. You have ignored repeated warnings about the consequences of betraying family interests. If you proceed with your foolish plans to give away the family fortune to strangers, you will discover that some betrayals carry prices too high to pay. This is your final opportunity to reconsider your actions before more drastic measures become necessary. Armed with this new evidence, Miss Marple returned to the library where the household had assembled for what Captain Greystone had described as a family meeting. The atmosphere was tense, with each person obviously uncomfortable about being gathered together under circumstances that suggested official interrogation. Timothy sat slouched in a corner chair, his earlier drunkenness replaced by what appeared to be a crushing hangover. Vivian perched nervously on the edge of a sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mrs. Pemberton stood stiffly near the fireplace, her expression carefully neutral, but her posture betraying her anxiety. Whitmore hovered by the door as if planning to bolt at the first opportunity, while Dr. Hartwell sat quietly near the windows, clearly uncomfortable with his role as an outsider witnessing family drama. Captain Greystone took his position behind the large oak desk, his military bearing evident as he surveyed the assembled group. I've asked Miss Marple to share her observations about the circumstances surrounding Aunt Constance's death, he said formally. I expect everyone to listen carefully and to answer any questions she may have with complete honesty. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the center of the room, her knitting bag in one hand and Lady Constance's journal in the other. Thank you, Captain Greystone. I want to begin by saying that this has been one of the most complex cases I've ever encountered, not because the facts are particularly mysterious, but because almost everyone involved has been hiding significant parts of the truth. She paused to survey the faces before her, noting the various degrees of discomfort and guilt that were evident in their expressions. Lady Constance was murdered by someone who knew her habits intimately, someone who had access to her private correspondence, and someone who was desperate enough to commit violence rather than allow her plans for the Sarah Hartwell Foundation to proceed. Timothy shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Miss Marple, we've all established that we had reasons to be unhappy about Aunt Constance's plans, but that doesn't mean any of us actually killed her. Quite true, Mr. Timothy. Motive alone doesn't constitute proof of guilt, but when motive is combined with opportunity, deception, and specific knowledge of the victim's plans, it begins to paint a clearer picture. Miss Marple opened Lady Constance's journal and began to read selected passages aloud. The revelation that Lady Constance had been aware of surveillance and had taken precautions to protect her documents caused visible reactions among several household members. The most significant clue, Miss Marple continued, is contained in these anonymous threatening letters that Lady Constance received in the weeks before her death. The writer was clearly someone with intimate knowledge of her plans and someone who felt entitled to interfere with her personal decisions. She held up the bundle of letters. The handwriting is disguised, but the paper is expensive, the sort used for formal correspondence. The vocabulary is educated and precise. Most importantly, the writer demonstrates detailed knowledge of Lady Constance's correspondence with Australia and her meetings with legal advisors. Vivian leaned forward anxiously. "Are you saying that someone in this room wrote those letters?" "I'm saying that someone in this house wrote those letters. Whether that person is currently in this room remains to be determined." Miss Marple turned, her attention to Whitmore, who had been growing increasingly pale during her presentation. "Whitmore, you told us that you turned Dr. Hartwell away yesterday morning because you didn't want Lady Constance to proceed with her foundation plans. But you didn't mention that you had been sending her anonymous letters for weeks, trying to frighten her into changing her mind." The butler's face went ashen. "I don't know what you're talking about, miss. I never sent her ladyship any letters. The paper used for the anonymous letters matches the stationery in the butler's pantry. The pen used was the same distinctive fountain pen that you use for household correspondence. Most significantly, the writer demonstrates the sort of detailed knowledge about family history and household routines that only someone in your position would possess." Whitmore's legs seemed to give out, and he collapsed into the nearest chair. "I never meant to frighten her," he whispered. "I just wanted her to understand what she was doing to the family." Captain Greystone's voice was stern. "Whitmore, did you write those threatening letters?" The butler nodded miserably. "Yes, sir, but I never threatened to hurt her physically. I just wanted her to reconsider her plans." "But the letters did threaten her," Miss Marple pointed out. "And when they failed to change her mind, you escalated to more direct action. You turned away Dr. Hartwell to prevent their meeting, hoping that would delay the foundation plans indefinitely." "That's all I did," Whitmore said desperately. "I sent the letters and I turned away Dr. Hartwell. I never hurt her ladyship. I would never hurt her." Miss Marple studied the butler's face carefully. His distress appeared genuine, and his confession about the letters had been given without coercion. But there were still significant gaps in his story that needed to be addressed. "Whitmore," she said gently, "when you heard footsteps in the corridor outside the morning room last evening, you assumed it was Lady Constance. But you also said the footsteps sounded heavier than usual. What if it wasn't Lady Constance at all? What if someone else was visiting her in the morning room?" The butler looked confused. "But who else would have been there?" "All the family members were in their rooms and the house was secure. Someone with a key," Miss Marple suggested. "Someone who knew the household routines well enough to move through the house without being detected." She turned to address the group as a whole. The killer needed several things to succeed: access to the house, knowledge of Lady Constance's plans, and the physical strength to deliver a fatal blow with the brass poker. They also needed to know that Lady Constance would be alone in the morning room at a specific time. Mrs. Pemberton spoke for the first time since the meeting began. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that the killer was someone from outside the family? Someone who had been watching the house and learning our routines?" "Not necessarily, Mrs. Pemberton, but I am suggesting that the killer had access to information that not everyone in the household possessed. For example, only a few people knew that Lady Constance was expecting Dr. Hartwell for morning tea. Only a few people knew about the significance of the Silver Teapot. And only one person knew that Dr. Hartwell had been turned away and wouldn't be arriving as expected." The implications of this statement hung in the air as each person considered who among them had possessed all the necessary information. Miss Marple allowed the silence to continue for several moments before continuing. with her analysis. The physical evidence suggests that Lady Constance was struck from behind, which indicates either a surprise attack or an assault by someone she trusted enough to turn her back on. The tea service had been prepared for 2 people, but only one cup showed signs of use. This suggests that the killer arrived either before or instead of the expected guest. Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat. Miss Marple, if I may ask, what do you think happened when I arrived at the house yesterday morning? If Whitmore turned me away without Lady Constance's knowledge, wouldn't she have wondered why I never appeared? An excellent question, Dr. Hartwell. And I believe the answer provides the key to understanding the entire crime. Miss Marple moved to the window and gazed out at the grounds where evening shadows were beginning to lengthen. Lady Constance prepared the morning room for your visit and waited for you to arrive. When you didn't appear at the appointed time, she would naturally have been concerned. She might have telephoned the inn where you were staying, or she might have sent someone to investigate your whereabouts. But I was at the inn all day, Dr. Hartwell protested. If she had inquired, she would have learned that I was there and available to meet with her. Exactly. Which means that either she didn't have the opportunity to make such inquiries, or someone prevented her from doing so. Miss Marple turned back to the assembled group, her expression grave. I believe that Lady Constance was murdered, not to prevent her from meeting with Dr. Hartwell, but because she had discovered that he had been turned away without her knowledge. When she realized that someone in her household had deliberately sabotaged her appointment, she understood that her suspicions about being watched and threatened were not paranoia, but fact. The silence that followed this revelation was broken by Timothy's nervous laugh. Are you saying that Aunt Constance was killed because she found out about Whitmore's interference? That seems rather extreme. Murder is always extreme, Mr. Timothy, but people commit extreme acts when they feel cornered and desperate. Lady Constance's discovery that her own butler had been working against her would have prompted immediate action. She would have demanded explanations, threatened dismissals, and possibly contacted the police. Miss Marple paused to study each face in the room. But more importantly, she would have realized that if Whitmore was willing to sabotage her meeting with Dr. Hartwell, he might also be willing to interfere with her other plans. The foundation documents, the will changes, the arrangements with the National Trust, all of these were vulnerable to sabotage by someone with inside access and detailed knowledge of her affairs. Whitmore's voice was barely a whisper. She didn't discover anything about Dr. Hartwell, miss. She never had the chance. She was already dead when I found her this morning. Miss Marple fixed him with a penetrating stare. Are you certain about that, Whitmore? Are you absolutely certain that Lady Constance never realized you had turned away her expected guest?